Hello, everyone. Welcome to CIAC 2020, this virtual conference. My name is Irvin Zabaleta. I use he, him, él pronouns. And on behalf of North Carolina Campus Combat, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session presented by Kyle Anderson. He's Assistant Director at the Kernodle Center for Service Learning and Community Engagement at Elon University. Just before he leads us into this presentation, talking about where are all the guys, where are we? See, let me just put my 2 cents over here. I am glad that the facilitator and the presenter are both guys. Where are all the guys? We're here. But we're going to be talking about male engagement, seriously, guys, as a growing concern. Just a couple housekeeping announcements. This session is being recorded. Thank you all so much for letting us pivot this virtual format of CIAC and this share knowledge and resources with everyone. We are very, very glad to have this session being presented, and just wanted to let you know about the Q&A option. So I'll be managing the Q&A towards the end of the session, so feel free to use the Q&A option towards the bottom of your Zoom, and Kyle will be using the chat option once he's going to ask for you all's feedback. So be sure that as you have a question, you don't have to wait till the end. You can just type it out, send it to me, and we'll have a discussion towards the end. You are all muted, but please send us your questions. We want to hear from you all. Raise your hand if you have something very particular that is very pressing. Please also you can raise your hand. Thank you all so very much. Without further ado, we're going to have Kyle. Kyle, thank you for being here.
Great, thanks everything. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all. I hope everyone is doing well as you can be in the sort of crazy times we're in right now. So just thanks for making time and space to join the conference today and also join for the session. Know that I really appreciate it. So as everybody mentioned, my topic is talking about male engagement. My presentation is called Where Are All the Guys? Male Engagement as a Growing Concern. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the relevancy of this issue, and then dive into an assessment project that I did last year as part of my job here at Elon, and then share some of the results from that. And then we'd love to hear also from y'all about your experiences engaging men on your campuses and what works well and what doesn't work. And hopefully you can come out of this with some good ideas and some things you can bring back to your campus for engaging men moving forward. I'll talk a little bit about my interest in the topic. I'm gonna have a couple spots where I stop talking and give you all a chance to share throughout. So before I jump in and share more about my background around this topic, my first question for you all is, and anyone can share as you're comfortable, but we'd love to hear more about why you're interested in this topic and why you chose to come to the conversation today. So I'll just pause here just for a minute and let some responses come in, and we'll just look at those, and then I'll keep moving on from there. Feel free to jump in when you're ready and just share a couple thoughts in the chat box. Responses coming in. Thank you, Russ. Thank you, a couple other folks. So y'all can see the chat responses coming in, so thanks for that. I'll just glance through these as we're going through, just so everyone can kind of hear from me as they're coming in. So learn more about getting male engagement involved in civic engagement activities. My institution is already 60% female, and our office engagement numbers don't reflect that. I can definitely relate to that. Kimmy from Duke shared, been on a committee the past year exploring this topic, written some more information just to draw attention to those issues. That's awesome. Lindsay shared, advised Rotaract, but it's often female dominated. Tara shares, we currently struggle to get male identifying students to participate in our programs, especially that are white. Represent student demographics from Caroline. Problem retaining male students, especially those of color. Lauren from ECU shares, we struggle with male engagement across all programs. They're interested in hearing what other campuses are doing. Engagement is more heavily female. Our population of student leaders and participants shows certain demographics. So similar themes in those comments, I think. So those things I think definitely resonate from my experience working at Elon, and I'll share some of those things here in a few minutes. So I think just seeing where each other's at, and I think often when I've heard this conversation, I think folks are thinking about it, but I don't quite know what to do with it, or the conversations are happening more in sort of disparate places, but folks aren't connecting. So I think those comments y'all shared in the chat box kind of, that resonates with me. So yeah, I appreciate y'all sharing. So I'll jump in here. There we go. So I asked you all about your interests, so I'm going to share a little about my interest in this topic as well. So just a little bit about my background and experiences as relates to this issue. So in undergrad, I was involved in a couple of different service organizations, had leadership roles in a number of student organizations. I did things like study abroad, had an internship, like many of us do who get involved in community engagement work and other work on campuses. One theme that I saw throughout those experiences is that I was one of the few male-identified folks participating in those things. So I sort of put that in my back pocket, and it was more of an observation at that point. But as I've gone further on in my professional career, I think I've seen that play out in more spaces. After I graduated, I worked in the nonprofit world before pursuing my grad degree in higher education, and in both my nonprofit experience and then also in my higher ed grad program, I was one of the few men in both those spaces. And then as I've gotten more into higher education and working primarily in community engagement offices at a couple of different institutions, that experience has been sort of bared out. There's been a lack of male engagement, a lack of male participation. So I've started to ask within the last couple of years sort of why. Why does this happen? There's got to be more to it. If I'm seeing this trend pop up, not just at one place that I've worked, but across different places and also across different lines of work as well. So just seeing sort of the lack of male engagement, I think, has been an issue of interest to me, in part because I was very much shaped by the experiences I had in undergrad. And I think I was able to figure out what my values are, see the power of transformative community engagement experiences, and they very much shaped who I am as a person. So I know the power of these experiences, so I've often wondered why more men aren't pursuing those experiences. So that's sort of one side around just my background and experiences. In terms of a little bit of context at Elon, I can mention we've definitely talked about this before and why men are not as engaged as female identified students. I think it's happened in sort of pockets over the last couple of years. I think more attention was placed on it in the last 2 or 3 years. 2 years ago, unfortunately, we had 2 deaths by suicide on campus, and both those were male students. So I think this raised the profile more of thinking about male engagement and put more of a sort of microscope on the issue. And more people across campus were having conversations around this issue just more broadly. And that led to a couple of different things and a couple of conversations moving forward, which I'll mention a little bit later in the presentation. I also think it's relevant for the time we are in. I think especially with us figuring out sort of hybrid learning situations and moving remote, I think we need to have keep a close eye on students who may not seek support, whether it be counseling or mental health services, or just reaching out to an academic advisor, student organization advisor. The data bears out from some work we did here at Elon, and I think this won't be too shocking for anybody, is that men are less likely to seek those services. So I think when we're moving to more remote or sort of hybrid situations, male students are going to be even harder to reach. I'm generalizing there, but I think there's some truth to that. And some of the data from our work at Elon sort of bears that out. So I think that's just an important thing for us to keep in mind. And also just the importance of healthy masculinity and healthy male engagement, I think, is also just important at any given time, and especially with the times that we're in. Last thing I'll mention around my interest in this topic. So I have two pictures up on the slide. They are not two pictures of random kids. Those are actually my kids. So I have a 4- and a 6-year-old, both boys. So as a dad to 2 young boys, this topic is especially of interest to me. Just thinking about how I can be a good role model for my 2 sons. How to create spaces where they can be vulnerable, but also appreciate sort of their male identities as well. So that's them being sensitive, and also the bottom picture being a little more rowdy. Their rowdiness has gone up tenfold since we've been more home over the last couple months. But just a personal issue of mine, both at work and then also at home as well, something I'm thinking about. So again, just want to share a little bit more about my interests, so y'all have some context to why I'm passionate about this issue. Go to my next slide here. Bear with me, my slides are loading a little bit slowly here. So want to talk a little bit more about the urgency before I jump into my assessment project that I alluded to earlier. So a couple other reasons why I think this issue is important. So just lack of involvement. In my office, the Kernodle Center at Elon, so I did the study last year, but our demographics are pretty similar this year as well. So we have usually about 100 to 120 student leaders involved in different roles in our office. Most of them are volunteer unpaid positions. We do have a handful of paid positions as well. So of all the leaders we had in our office last year, only about 15% of those were men, which was about 17 total students. And of those students, about 2/3 were in paid positions. So as you look at the demographics of our office and know that obviously having students from all different identities is important to our work, there's definitely a lack of male engagement and presence in leadership roles in the Kernodle Center at Elon. I think also there's a couple comments about just sort of demographics at institutions as well. And I think this is becoming more seen, especially at sort of more private institutions, just the growing gap between the demographics. So at Elon, this is oversimplified data, doesn't take into account transgender students, but generally we have sort of a 60-40 ratio. So 60% of students who are female identified and about 40 that are male. And those gaps have spread out over time. So that gap is sort of growing. I'll mention a working group that I was on this past year later, but our working group found things, again, these things are probably, they might be bearing out on your campus, but the data bear this out. Even though we have less men on campus, men are overrepresented in student conduct cases and then underrepresented in utilizing counseling services. So our conduct officers are seeing male students more, but those students aren't seeking services. You can see how that's problematic and sets up some issues right there. There's also an issue of retention as well. There's some studies out, this one's a little bit older, but I think still relevant, that show men are less likely to graduate, and in part because I just mentioned less likely to seek support. So just this issue of resilience and perseverance is really important. And there's data that bears out that when men hit hard times, they're less likely to seek supportive services on campus. So that impacts campus graduation rates as well. So I want to bring back the chat box again. A couple questions for y'all, and you could approach this however you want, but just want to get some more thoughts out there just for a minute. So we'd love to hear more about just what male involvement looks like in your office or department in particular. I'll ask about your institution later, but just wondering about your department. So curious to hear more just like the gender breakdown in your offices or departments, and then love to hear about what are programs that men are involved in, and then what are they not involved in? Just again, get a sense of kind of where folks are coming from. So I'll just stop talking there for a minute and then let some more comments come in the chat box. So share as you're comfortable, and then I'll read off some of the comments as they come in. Okay, Caroline shares, male students represent only 10 to 20% of our student participants. Thank you for that comment. All right, got a couple more coming in. Thank you all. So Erin shares our office houses fraternity and sororities as well. So we see more involvement from men, maybe because of that Greek life presence. Our paid student staff are all female. We've seen a large increase in males in our service program student roles. That's cool, but the group of men we have are all friends and they join together. So that is interesting. Lynn shares mostly athletics. Mackie shares out of 25 student leaders, only 3 were male identified and 2 of those were in paid roles. So again, that bears out what we have, I think, in our office as well. Elon, so some trends there. Carolyn jumping in again. Male students are more likely to participate in any program we offer that includes words like innovation and leadership. Okay, some buzzwords there. Kimmy jumped in. We have service learning assistants from Duke Service Learning, but not a lot of men in those roles. Okay, Dalton sharing about 30-70 ratio. Okay, Lindsay sharing most of our males have a class requirement, so that requirement piece I think is interesting as well. Most men are involved in SGA and other sort of campus activities and boards. Tiffany shared the club and orgs that our males are most involved with is a gaming and video club, Dungeons and Dragons. We also have a male minority group on campus, mostly through athletics, our sort of male engagement. Rush shares that males get involved with our barbershop talks. Interested to hear more about that. And student affairs and sort of male mentorship. Okay. And then Jennifer shares male students participate at higher levels in our civic engagement programs, but are underrepresented in volunteer projects. Interesting. Cool. So I think get some themes in there, but also some different experiences from folks. So later on in the chat, I'll open up some more. I want to hear more about kind of what's working well for y'all as we share kind of best practices. Awesome. Thank you all to who shared. I appreciate that. Moving on to finish up some conversation around urgency. Give me a second for the next slide to pop up. So as I was looking at this, I looked at some literature. There's not a ton out there, but there's some more out there, which is helpful, and I'll share some resources too in a little bit. One author, and I've read this book, it's called Guyland by Michael Kimmel, who sort of speaks to this idea of male engagement and healthy masculinity within higher education, but also more broadly. So you can see a quote up here that he puts up on the slide. So he talks about how we have a constructed idea of masculinity in our country that gives boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity in a way that makes them go prove it all the time. He encouraged us to have a conversation between men and boys about the cost to us for portraying our own values in the name of proving our masculinity to others. So I think this is definitely a theme that sort of bears out. A couple things I'll share about this from Kimmel's work. So he talks about just the, obviously there's importance of building relationships, but in order to build healthy relationships, we need to be vulnerable with each other. And that is for a variety of reasons, just because of how men are socialized. Just having, sort of jumping in and having deeper sort of vulnerable conversations is hard. And I think like across any identity, there's definitely peer pressure, but I think that definitely plays out in male culture as well. So there's this pressure to be sort of a quote unquote real man, Kimmel talks about. Men may have a sort of set of certain values that they betray in order to conform to peer pressure. So that's definitely an issue that I think our male identified students do have to navigate and figure out what to do with. Next slide here. So I want to share a quote. Y'all might be familiar with, I call her one of my prophets, Brene Brown, who I think shares lots of great things around vulnerability and shame more broadly. But I think this also connects with some of the issues that our male students might be having. This quote is from a Netflix special that she released last year, which I'd recommend if you're looking for some Netflix recommendations during our time at home. She has a Netflix special called Call to Courage, which came out about last April. So Brene shares that messages of shame are organized around gender. For women, there are whole constellations of often contradictory expectations that, if not met, are sources of shame. But for men, she shares the overarching message is that weakness is shameful. And since vulnerability is often perceived as weakness, it is especially risky for men to practice vulnerability. So again, kind of echoing the thoughts that Michael Kimmel mentioned before, just vulnerability is harder for men for a variety of different reasons, and in large part because of how they're socialized. So I think it's important coming into conversations with men, just realizing that it's harder for them to get into that space. And it might take extra work to build relationships where they can feel safe and comfortable, willing to share beyond surface level things. And in terms of our work, working in the community, obviously folks are pushed, and you have to think about what you value and why you get involved, and that can be a harder place for men to go at given times. So again, that's just talking a little bit about the urgency. So I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about my actual project that I worked on last year. So at Elon, in our student life division, which the Kernodle Center, my office, is part of, we have an assessment and planning committee, which asks each department across our division to have at least one staff person, potentially more, pursue an assessment project each year. So I know assessment and evaluation is a hard topic to jump into, and one thing that everyone wants to get better at, but there isn't often space. So I appreciated that we had some structure at Elon to do this, but we had some flexibility on our topic. So as I mentioned, this idea was something that I was excited about, floating around in my head for a while. As part of my role here at Elon, I oversee outreach. So I think about how we recruit and bring in student leaders in our office. So it was sort of naturally a topic that was relevant to me personally, but also my position as well. So I was excited to be given approval to pursue this. So last year, again, I created an assessment project just to learn more about male engagement and how are men engaging, how are they not engaging, and also learning about more about male culture and perceptions of male culture at Elon. So my goal was to sort of ask these couple different questions, which you can see up here on the slide. So our programs we offer in the Kernodle Center appealing to male students? Is how we market appealing or not? What are some other departments on campus that do a good job of bringing men in, and what can we learn from them? And then sort of what are overall perceptions of male culture on campus? So just to share about my methods for my project, so I set up two different focus groups. Both were within student leaders in our office. So one I separated by female identified students and one male identified students, so I could give them each space to share. As I mentioned, our male population is a little bit lower, so we had less students participate, but got good feedback from the male students who participated. My female identified group was very active and very excited to participate and had lots of thoughts, but good thoughts to share about their experiences working with experiences and also perceptions of male culture on campus. I also did a survey, anonymous survey of student leaders outside the Kernodle Center, so students that may have not been having experiences with our office, maybe knew about us a little bit or had no sort of exposure, just to get feedback of students beyond our work. So I think all in all with the survey and then the two focus groups, I had about 50 or 60 responses, so not a huge sample size, but enough to get some good feedback and start to develop some information on some themes. So after those conversations and after the survey, I looked at all the data that we collected and then organized them into different themes, and then ended up creating a report, which I submitted as part of the assessment project. So before I jump into some of the themes from the report, I want to bring the chat box back up. And these were three of the questions that I asked the students. I think I asked about 10 to 12 questions in the survey and the focus groups. They were all very similar questions, so I wanted to have some reactions around similarly themed questions. Some of them are framed a little bit different, but generally got at some of the same things. So I want to pose those questions to you all. So this is thinking more broadly about your campus. So and some of this came out in your comments before, but love to hear what are your perceptions of a male sort of culture on your campus? What are male students involved in more largely beyond your office? And then what offices do a good job of attracting male students? So you could respond to one of those questions, all three, you can put a couple words down, but just wanted to hear some more thoughts from y'all before we go on with the conversation. So I will stop talking here for a minute and then open up the chat box and see what y'all think. Caroline, thank you for sharing. So Caroline shares men on our campus tend to be more attracted to paid opportunities and opportunities that are clearly tied to their career goals. It's also very similar to Elon. I'll actually mention more about that in a second as well. Kimmy from Duke shares, I think the words, again, innovation leadership, which Kimmy mentioned before, are salient from men at Duke. The wellness program has had success with drumming circles recently. Okay, that's cool and interesting. So yeah, again, thinking how we frame things and thinking about language, I think it really is an important piece. I appreciate that comment. Rush shares evolving and level of activism, and then athletics, and then more social events. Kimmy also shares through some of the work that they've done at Duke, men tend to do things more with their friends, like study abroad. Alex shares Greek life. Mackie shares SGA, more prestigious position with notoriety. That's interesting. Pay over volunteer. And offices and spaces that are identity related do a good job engaging male students with more sort of identity-based work. It's also interesting. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. I appreciate, again, hearing that and just hearing what other people's experiences are. So I'm going to minimize the chat here for a second and then go to my next slide. Load. Okay. So I'm not going to share all the data we collected, but wanted to share some of the themes from the focus group and survey I had, just to share with y'all some things there. So we asked students about their perceptions of male culture at Elon. Unfortunately, there was a lot of sort of negative connotation. Some of the themes that came up were things around toxic or toxic masculinity, disengaged and apathetic, shallow or insecure, exclusive, and with a limited focus. I pulled out a couple of quotes that sort of get at the themes around culture. Sort of this quote on apathetic. One student shared that many males choose not to get involved in activities beyond sort of the social realm and aren't taking full advantage of what our campus has to offer. And then another quote below that, a large number of male students do not feel as though they can discuss how they feel with others, especially other males. They project an exterior based upon how they think they should act, but it's out of touch with who they actually are. We had comments were mentioned. I think there's definitely some sort of crossover with some of these comments from our students here at Elon. And then also speaking back to the points I made before from Brene Brown and Michael Kimmel about just vulnerability and how that's a harder thing for male students, and that I think bared out in the conversations that I had. My next slide, just another thing I want to share around perceptions of male engagement and service here at Elon. So students share that their general perception was that male students were not very engaged except when required. So this sort of required piece I think is interesting, and that came out from your all's experiences as well. More engagement is through fraternities. So Greek life is pretty big here at Elon, so that bears on our campus, and a couple other comments as well. And then one thing I thought was interesting, which also came up a little bit in some of your all's comments, is a preference for men to serve in groups as opposed to doing individual service opportunities. More on that in 1 second, but I thought that's interesting as well. And I have another quote here, which I won't read off, but just sort of speaks to this idea of perception around service. I'll breeze through this slide. There's a lot of text on here, but I think two things for everyone to think about. So on your campuses, which this sort of came out in conversations with my project, is there a focus on healthy male gender identity development? I think it's important to recognize male identity is complex, and I think we need to consider sort of intersectionality around male identities with other groups. One thing I will mention, which is unfortunately not surprising, I think especially in fields that aren't as well researched, the focus is on white male students. So a lot of the research out there right now is more white male-centric. So I think there needs to be a push for thinking about men from different identities, and more research there, such as was sort of born out as I looked at resources and sort of studies out there. So talking about positive, healthy male gender identity development across different identities. One thing I think also is interesting is framing. So what is the social hierarchy for men on campus? I think often at our campus, there's sort of like an archetype of sort of who men are, whether it's sort of the fraternity brother, the student athlete, and there's definitely some truth to that, but I think other men who don't fit those stereotypes get lost in that. And I think there's sort of like if you're not one of those things, you're sort of less than. So I think how that plays out is interesting as well. And that's just sort of a question for you all to consider. Sort of who's held up on your campus, and what stories are told about men on campus, and how does that keep some men out of the story, just sort of based on that sort of dominant sort of way we look at men on our campuses. So next slide, I want to go to some of my recommendations, which I hope these are helpful for y'all as we kind of think about what do we do with the information I collected. One thing I have here up on the slide, I just want to call out, obviously, male privilege is real. We all know that. So this work isn't meant to take away from other work. And I think I don't recommend at all taking resources away from obviously other marginalized groups and different identities that need resources that don't have them. So I just want to call that out. And I also think it's important that some of these ideas I think can benefit both men, but also other identities as well. So just want to breeze through a couple different of these things. So in the spaces we occupy, I think it's important to ask men about their involvement and encourage opportunities. I think a lot of our students, men especially, come into campus with sort of a preconceived notion of what college is. They may not even know about offices that do service or volunteer-based work. So I think just letting men know early on what is out there. There's more to college, obviously, than just the social scene. There are other ways to explore leadership development opportunities, and I think male students are even less likely to know about even those things existing. So I think just looking about how we market things and where we go to market things and talk about male students is really important. Mentioned this before, so male students favor group service opportunities over individual service opportunities. That came out in my conversations both with female identified leaders and then male identified leaders. So I think it's an interesting thing for us to think about is how we're setting up our service opportunities. And if you have more group opportunities, are men more likely to come? A couple comments were around how men more likely to go with sort of their friends and their peers. I think that bears out just from my lived experiences in my work at Elon. So I think thinking about how we set up service opportunities and then encouraging men to volunteer together, go together, I think could be helpful. Another point I want to underscore as well, if men are less likely to engage outside the classroom, which I think is borne out from my conversations and experiences, and I think your all's comments as well, think about how we engage them in the classroom. I contacted our registrar as part of the study just to get a breakdown of what are the primary majors for male students on campus? And I have a list here from last year. So heavy around business and communications. There's a couple other ones as well. So obviously those male students are taking those classes. So in the Kernodle Center, we support academic service learning classes. So how can we encourage professors to develop meaningful content and classwork within majors so we can engage men in the classroom if they're not engaging outside the classroom? I think is really important. Next point is around sort of peer mentorship, which is important for all students, but I think especially for male students. As I mentioned before, it can be, I think, harder for male students to develop deeper, more valuable relationships, but I think they are seeking them. So I think, like any identity, I think being able to find yourself and other folks. So looking for positive male role models, both among student leaders, but also faculty and staff as well. And how do we connect them with men and put them in spots where men can get to know those folks? I think that's vital as well. A couple other recommendations I have up here. So this also came out in some of your comments as well, based on the data that I collected. Male students are more inclined to do service when there's sort of a tangible benefit. So I hate to say it, but it's sort of like what's in it for me, which doesn't mean they're not coming with good intentions, but I think they want that clear connection between, if I do this thing, then how is it helping me advance my career or build my resume? I think that's true of all students from my experience, but I think male students in particular. So I think it's important to work across different majors, and connect majors with different service opportunities, and also how we market our programs and very clearly like saying, this is what you'll get out of this program, I think is really important. Also based on the data I collected, and this also came out as well, so we're all on the same page here. I think recognition is important. I think it's important for all students, but also male-identified students. At Elon, we have something in our business school, which I think is a good model, called the Business Honor Roll. So there's a staff member that helps oversee that, and they track students who are doing meaningful volunteer work every semester, and then recognize those students. So I think that's sort of one model recognition, how we can hold people up, and there's that sort of resume, career building piece, but also hopefully doing meaningful work as well. How we share male stories, I've mentioned that a bit, but talking about male involvement and stories of men engaging in the community, I think is really important to fight against sort of that stereotype of the stories we often hear about men on campus. And I alluded to this before, but I think, how do we engage first-year men? I think first-year students coming in, especially male students, may not know what opportunities are out there. So I think getting them early and letting them know what are sort of the opportunities that exist that are out there for them to consider. So yeah, those are some of my core recommendations. I just wanted to walk through those so y'all can see those. Again, hopefully some of those things resonate and are helpful as y'all kind of think about how you might want to approach this on your campus. Want to pause there because I've talked for a couple minutes in a row there. Just want to see if any of those recommendations resonate before I go on to my next question. So I'll pause there for a minute and give you all a chance to chime in on the chat if you'd like. All right, we have a couple comments coming in. Thank y'all. Kimmy shares that definitely resonate, especially the importance of peer relationships and creating a strong foundation from the get-go. Thank you for sharing that. Erin shares, I'm interested in what they can do around service events, especially things in groups. Appreciate that. We can definitely get back to that when we talk about some questions. Can I go back to the previous slide? Yeah, I can do that in a second. Focus on physical and outdoor activities. Yeah, at Elon, we have sort of an adventure-based sort of outdoor learning program, and I think we have more male students in those programs. So I think those have seen, I think, good traction on our campus. So just to share that, if your campus has, opportunities like that. Erin also shares, I advise a group of peer leadership educators. If you are male, I'm interested in empowering them to coordinate something for male peers to discuss those issues. That's great. Cool. Well, thank you all for jumping in who shared. I can go back to the last slide if that's helpful real quick. Slides will let me. And if they don't, I'm comfortable, and I think this will be shared out afterwards as well if you all want to be able to see those recommendations. One second, my computer's thinking. Okay, I think I went to the next slide. Sorry about that. We'll definitely share out these recommendations afterwards. Y'all can see them if they're helpful. Want to ask another question for the chat? Again, this has kind of come out a little bit, but I'm definitely one voice in this conversation. I want to give space, if anyone has any things that have gone well on your campus, just to share some other examples. I'm interested in those, and then want to open up that space for others as well. So I'll just give also a minute to do that too, and we can look at those. So they kind of come in the chat as well. So ideas that have gone well for engaging male students on your campus. If anyone wants to share, I'll give a minute or two for that. So wait and see if there's any comments, and if there are any ideas, I'm glad you came. So hopefully this is helpful. We're creating some ideas. Okay, Russ, share. Thank you, Russ. We have created the Champion Scholars Program for Black male students, introduced them to civic engagement. Faculty and staff serve as mentors. That's awesome. So I think it might have been you earlier. Someone mentioned just civic engagement, how that resonates with male-identified students, and then just sort of this mentorship piece, I think, is also really important as well. So that's a great example. I'm gonna jot that down so I can check that out later. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, Kimmy shares the Duke Women's Center has had good success with the Duke Men's Project, which aims to create a space of brotherhood, fellowship, dedicated to integrating male privilege and patriarchy as it exists in our lives. Awesome. Lynn shares having male guest speakers. Caroline's asking about thoughts around better attracting men versus somehow sort of this toxic masculinity conversation that prevents men from getting in the first place. That's a great question. I'll jot that down. Lindsay shares partner with our Man Up Minority Male Mentoring Group, and they participate as a group in one service project per semester. Thank you for sharing that. Erin shares we have a leadership program for student athletes that seek to pair male athletes with male mentors on campus. That's really cool. Tiffany shares we're looking at doing an event called Mental Health during our Mental Health Week, and partner with our minority male group in athletics to have conversation around these topics. Very cool. Okay, great. Great examples. I appreciate y'all sharing those, and I'm jotting those down so I can look at them later as well. So thank you for sharing those. I appreciate the question about, I want to address that one and hear any other thoughts around just sort of this, how do you have this conversation and not feel like men are being attacked? I think it's a really great question. I don't know if I have a perfect answer to that, but I'm going to address that when we go to questions in a minute, because I think that's a really, really relevant question. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing those. I appreciate it. I think it's good to just hear some examples of what's going well out there. I'm going to close the chat just for 1 second, and I want to talk just about kind of next steps, as we have just a couple minutes left here. What are we doing at Elon now? So I wish I could say we sort of waved the magic wand and men are engaging at extra high levels right now. We're working on it, but that's definitely not the case. I think we have some good thoughts out there that are keeping the conversation moving forward, which I'm excited about, but we're still definitely working on it. One thing I want to share, which was beyond my project, but luckily something I got a chance to join in on this past year. So more broadly than the Kernodle Center, my office, so every year Elon has a couple working groups in our student life division exploring different topics. And I was excited that last year we explored a working group based around healthy masculinities and male engagement. I think Kimmy may have something like this at Duke as well, which was cool. So this working group was put together just to do a more sort of broad look at male engagement. And what was cool about it is that we brought together folks from different departments with different perspectives and working with men in different ways on this group. So I'm not much more beyond my office. So I appreciated that opportunity to hear from different staff members and their experiences. And we also had some students involved in the group as well. So we ended up having 3 subgroups for that and looked at some different areas. We did talk to some other campuses. One thing I'll share is which may not be shocking, but as we looked more into it, there's not a lot of campuses thinking about this in a very deep and intentional way. There's sort of pockets of, I think, innovative and interesting programs, but I think everyone, we obviously talked to every campus in the country, but a fair amount are struggling with this issue or kind of thinking about it, but just don't know quite what to do with it. So just want to share that. That was validating for us because we didn't really, we're still figuring it out too with Elon. And then after this past year, we've just finished up a recent report, which will be shared with across our division, which is about 14 different departments. And then we're encouraging different departments to explore different areas. And then there's also some broad themes where folks can take up things that they want. So it's not just a sort of one departmental effort, but something that's totally done across departments. I do want to share a couple of the more broad recommendations on my next slide, which I'll get to here, that we recommended as a committee. So give me a second here to pull up that slide. It's loading. A lot of text in the slides, so I apologize for that, but the report was pretty dense and had a number of different things we recommended, but I thought these things were most relevant for our conversation here this morning. So a couple things we recommended was amplifying existing work. There are a couple select campuses where there's like an office or a staff person dedicated just to male engagement and healthy masculinity. That is rare, which is probably not surprising. And with resources, becoming more tight these days, it's not likely there's going to be offices engaged in this. So it's important to create connections across offices for folks who are already passionate and thinking about this. So I'd recommend that as something to consider, which we're considering as well, because we're not going to create an office around healthy masculinity, but think about how folks across different pockets can do this. Mentioned this already, and this was brought up in the comments, but just the importance of male mentors is really important. At Elon, we just launched our new 10-year strategic plan, and we also have a division plan as well coming out. We like our plans at Elon, but mentorship was really important in both these plans, and I think male mentorship is definitely a piece of that, obviously, as well. So I think figuring out how you can tap male students to be sort of peer mentors in positions where they're going to have access to a lot of male students, so whether that's through residence life. At Elon, we have living and learning communities. A new LLC is going to be created next year called Mentor. I appreciate the name for that one. And one of their roles is to be positive role models and peer mentors for other male students. That's going to be more upper class led living and learning community. How to engage in academic advisors to have meaningful and positive conversations with men. If you have university one-on-one courses, that's another space. Also in orientation and obviously through classes. This idea of sort of a central space for men came out as well. One comment before was about just sort of like this fantasy sports gaming culture. I think we have to recognize that is a thing, and I think that's a way men gather. But instead of having a space where they're doing it alone in their rooms or with just one of their their roommate, if space allows, or turning into another space to sometimes have sort of a social gathering space for men where they can do things that they're passionate or excited about, and hopefully create a space for positive relationship building. So I think that's one thing I wanted to hold up. Getting more data. I think that's important just to sort of know the lay of the land, which I think has been one of the most helpful things for us at Elon and me doing this report. One example I want to call out, one thing we want to explore more. So at Elon, we have every student's required to do 2 experiential learning experiences. So we want to see what's the breakdown of men in those experiences and what men are participating and not participating in, and how we can work to sort of leverage those experiences because they are a required thing. Thinking about how we can embed conversations around positive and healthy masculinity into training and education that already exists for student leaders. Greek life is a big one. I think that's a space where those conversations need to happen if Greek life is big on your campus. So how do we embed that training into that space? Also student employment, SGA, RA training, orientation, student work training, campus rec and wellness is another spot where a lot of male students are. So going to where men are, making sure they're getting some training content and conversations as part of whatever training they have already, if space allows for that. And then mentioned this already a couple times, but just thinking about the stories we tell about men, holding up positive stories instead of just negative stories, which are often the ones that we hear about. So again, just a couple more examples I wanted to share that I thought would be helpful. I go a bit beyond sort of the scope of my work. I did it on my report. That's about all the content I have. So I just want to pause there. And at this point, I welcome any other sort of comments, thoughts, or questions in the last couple minutes that I have. And then after that, I have a couple slides about resources, which I'll pull up. And then those will be in my slides, which y'all can look at later in case they're helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. This has been really, really good. You gave us a lot of food for thought, and I think that we're gonna, at least I'm gonna use I statements here. I'm gonna be leaving this workshop with a lot of questions to continue exploring this topic. That you're right, now there's not a lot of literature, so perhaps the faculty in the room can help us with that. But at this time, we're really good on time. So thank you, Kyle. We want to hear your questions. What are you thinking? Any comments that you may have with this presentation? Feel free to use the Q&A bots or the chat if you feel more comfortable with the chat. That is also an option. So, but yeah, questions, comments, or thoughts for Kyle.
And as questions are coming in, I can, I like the question before that was asked about just sort of the idea, how do we approach men in these conversations without victimizing them? I think men need to be pushed, obviously, but also it's a hard place to go into a conversation where you enter a space and you're, I think, and sort of centralize it around toxic masculinity, which is a real thing. But I think it might shut off some men, which I think is often the case when we talk about privilege. Obviously, if you lead with that, you may, people might be less engaged. So one thing that I've seen just work well, not directly, but from another colleague. So we have someone who does our bias training, and then who is partnered with our gender and LGBTQIA office. And the person from the our GLC, our gender-based office, identifies as female. And she's had a hard time entering some of those spaces, I think, and being respected, unfortunately, but I think it's a reality, especially when she's done some sort of intentional and really meaningful trainings with student athletes or group student leaders. So I think it's been helpful to have our person in our Title IX office who also helps with these trainings, and they've co-facilitated. So I think having a male presence in those spaces, I think, is helpful. Which is unfortunate, but I think it's real. So I think when that staff member has been in those trainings, I think that person's been receptive to, more receptive to that person, which isn't fair, but I think that's a reality. And that person who's been in those trainings, has a background as a student athlete. So I think folks can resonate with that person's experiences. So I think look at who you invite to those conversations, and who can connect with men in a meaningful way. It's one thing I think we've seen work pretty well at Elon. By all means, that's not the only solution, but that's sort of one thing. But just recognizing that is a hard thing, and I think it's easy for folks to get disengaged if you feel like you're sort of coming at them. But with that said, I think male students especially needs to be nudged and pushed outside their comfort zone, which often they don't. Especially for white men, they're not put in that space.
Great, thank you, Kyle. We do have, so we have one question in the chat box and one question so far in the Q&A. Although the question is, Kyle, if you have some thoughts, they want to know that too, but also it seems that the question is for Kimi. So Kimi, if you feel comfortable, I can unmute you and you can chime in as well. But let's go ahead and answer the question in the chat box. Please, we have plenty of time. So please, this is the time to share and to get questions answered. All right, so will the Healthy Masculinities and Male Engagement Working Group continue meeting and working on the goals you outlined, or will that work be housed somewhere else in Student Affairs?
Yeah, great question. We were pondering that question as well, and we knew we weren't. Obviously, it'd be great to have an office for this, but it'd be great to have an office for many other things as well. So we didn't think that was a reality, and now it's even less of a reality. So how does this work continue? So I think one strategy I mentioned, so when we put together our working report, I think it was helpful to have folks across different offices in that, so they can help create buy-in. It's not just our office saying we should do this, but folks across. I think there was someone from every department in our student life division, which was helpful, so they can carry back that message and be sort of a main point of contact for that. So I think that'll be helpful for helping the work happen. There's less clarity on this now, but one of our recommendations was we wanted to see a more broad university working group created around this issue for the reason I think Kimmy was getting at, just to make sure it keeps happening and it's not just a conversation in student life. That's also a conversation that can happen in academic affairs and other pockets across campus. So still, I think that's to be determined, but as we sort of exit the recommendation phase or the report phase and go into implementation of recommendations, that's one thing that we're hopeful to see. If there isn't sort of university-wide group, I think there's enough energy across different departments where student life is excited, I think, to carry forward some of these initiatives. So I'll be interested to see also what kind of happens there, but it's a little bit unknown at this point.
I think that I really appreciate, Kyle, how you are bringing what could happen and should happen with with today's reality, right? Yeah. About the lack of funding, and so I definitely appreciate your efforts working at Elon, trying to get this committee amplified. All right, so this question in the Q&A, again, continue to send us your questions. So let's see, it says, I recall Kimi sharing in the chat box that she's on a committee that drafted a memo to send to the administration about these issues. Kimi, can you share more about this? Maybe your hopes for how the administration will address the disparities. And you are on mute on my end.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's a really good question. And to be honest with you all, we have not sent it yet. We were really hoping to in February or March, but then with everything that happened, it just felt obviously with timing really challenging to send this to upper level administration. So we're now at a point, I think, where it's sort of that, is it ever going to be a good time? Like, it's probably good for us to at least just get this moving a little bit more in terms of bringing this to their attention. And the administrators that we're going to send it to are aware that our working group has been meeting, but really the memo, it's pretty brief, about 3 pages, and really kind of contains data about, similar to what Kyle was sharing, kind of breakdown of male and female identified students in different majors, and does that predict kind of involvement in civic engagement initiatives, as well as some results from our focus groups and recommendations, which are honestly similar to what Kyle has mentioned. So I think we would also hope that with higher administration knowing about this, that a more kind of systematic approach can take place across these different programs like Kyle has talked about, whether in student affairs or on the academic side. So I think we're hoping that we're at the stage of hoping to amplify the issue and kind of bring it more to their attention, and then hopefully from there be able to also either, I think ideally have a group that is continuing to work on this. And, we always are talking about, we need to collect more data and really kind of have more probably students at the table in this conversation. So I think those are some of our hopes right now, but we're still at the phase of just trying to kind of finalize it and get it sent to upper administration. And then from there kind of follow up and see what we can do given the very different circumstances right now, which may understandably sort of slow kind of progress with it. But we do feel it's important to still kind of amplify the issue.
Thank you, Kimi.
Sure.
So I have a follow-up question, Kyle, when it comes to, this is just so interested, given that there was a team from Student Life, and you said there was like several departments in like under the Student Life's umbrella. Like, can you share a little bit more about the makeup, like in terms of male and female staff leaders on it? And you kind of were alluded to this, but I'm interested in process and group dynamics. How was the group dynamics in discussing this? Was there ever tension about the topics being discussed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for Kimi for sharing as well. I appreciate those examples. In terms of our group, so I would say it was one of the few committees where there was more men than women on the committee, which was, I think, a good thing for the sake of this committee. But it was definitely a well-balanced group, I think, both in terms of male-female representation and then also leadership roles. Which I think we do usually a pretty good job of that in our working groups, where there's more sort of higher level folks who are directors or overseeing directors. And then, I think folks across all different leadership levels. So I think that helps just for adding different perspectives in. So I think that, helped bring in different perspectives, and people knew certain things that other people didn't, or what initiatives could be possible based on staffing and resources and structure. So that's one thing that worked for us well. It wasn't just sort of like, folks from some one level sort of shouting out what they think. It was a nice representation of different folks. So I think that was good. I think we were all on the same page. I think for the most part, I think Kimi mentioned this as well. We had some student voice, but I think would have loved to have more student voice in it. So I think if we move forward with implementation, we want to get student voice. We did have a listening session where we invited in a handful of male student leaders to share their experiences, and that was the diverse makeup of groups. I think that was good for capturing the white experience, the experience of Black identified male, experience of sort of gay identified male. So we have a bunch of different experiences. I think all men are having different experiences in a uniform experience on campus. I think we did overall a pretty good job of getting some different voices. Could have done a little more about getting some more student voices, but we also did get student voices as part of the process. Yes, I think the biggest thing is we just had a long list of ideas, and I think it's sort of like, what do we do with that and what's actually feasible and possible. I think one thing that was helpful, not every working group we have always has one person from each department. We have 2 co-chairs who are part of the group, and they did a great job of making sure there was somebody from every department. And I think that just makes it more feasible to carry forward those recommendations because you have a champion in each office. So I think, and I was able to share some things that I thought were good for that our office was already thinking about, and then the fact that in the report other people can see those things. One example of that is just engaging, which I mentioned before, fraternity men in more meaningful service opportunities. I think that's an area that we can actually make traction on and have done a little bit. But the fact that it was in this report, I think it helps I think lend a little more credence to that idea. I think any committee working group obviously has its messiness, and just getting everyone in one room is always hard. But I think overall it's a good group, and I think again our co-chairs did a great job setting it up and then sort of divvying up the workload throughout.
Great. So Cal, I know that you have some kind of resources and to share with us.
Yep, I can pull it up on my next slide. We get to there. One thing I'll also mention as my next slide is loading. One thing I didn't share that I give credit to my colleague, Sarah Williams, who I don't think is on, he's on the other presentation here this morning. But Sarah's done a great job engaging men in service, and we have, I think, 2 good structures for that have worked well in our office. So one of Sarah's areas of work is we have a partnership with our student athletics department where she serves as a liaison between another person in athletics, thinking about how do we engage student athletes in service. That's not just men, that's men and women obviously, but male athletes play a big part in that. So that's really helpful for our campus. Obviously it's part of her job description, so that's helpful. But if you don't have a partnership with athletics, I think it's something worth sort of entertaining and considering. Sarah's also done a great job of, she advises our Habitat for Humanity chapter. It's done a great job of creating partnerships with fraternities to partner on Habitat for Humanity builds. So I think we don't want to generalize or stereotype, obviously, but I think there is some truth that men are find sort of physical work a little more enticing than non-physical work. Again, generalizing that, but I think there is some value in that. And we've had a lot of fraternities partnering with our Habitat for Humanity chapter and doing some ongoing builds there. So think about programs you already have in your office that may not be engaging men, but you don't have to create a new program for it. And how can you work to create spaces for men to be connected with those programs? So I just want to share those examples. All right, I'll try going to my resources here. Sorry, I'm just loading here. My computer's getting used to coming on as well. All right, there we go. So these are some resources that I referred to in just my sort of presentation. So there's more out there, but a couple things I'll just call out. I won't read through all these. There's a couple articles out there. Again, there's not a ton of literature, but there is some. One office that's interesting is called the Center for Study of Masculinities and Male Development. That comes out of Western Illinois. So they have an actual center there. We're both engaging this work on the ground, but also thinking about it from a theoretical sort of literature research perspective. So they have some good stuff. There are a couple of books out there who've done studies. One's the College Men and Masculinity Study. A couple articles out there that I've referenced. I have the Guyland book that I referenced earlier. Michael Kimmel also has some good TED Talks as well out there. You can just search him and find those pretty easily. There are some other books there outside of higher education, but just talking about male development. Raising Cain, it's a little bit older, but still relevant. Want to mention that. And I think there still is, I know there was at some point, a NASPA, if you're part of NASPA, a Men and Masculinities Knowledge Community. And they've put on some drive-on conferences and have some good resources. So that's another space you can keep engaging in those conversations as well. One more slide. These are books that we referenced and looked at. This is the working group that I was part of. What's cool about this list, just a picture of these different books, is it's a wide range of different books. It just doesn't focus on the sort of white male perspective, but there is other literature out there focusing on different perspectives. And you can see those, as you look through those titles, you can see what other literature is out there. I appreciated that. We had to dig a little bit to find some of these things, but there are books out there to speak to all different, versions of the male experience. I think it's, like I said before, it's important to, this isn't just a white, male, issue. I think it's important to think about other identities and how we're engaging men across the spectrum. So I'll leave that slide up there as well. So yeah, those are, again, there's more out there, but those are some of the core resources that we look to as we're thinking about this work here at Elon.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle, for this presentation. If you don't mind putting your email in the chat box for
Oh,
folks
sorry.
if they want to get in contact with you or have any more questions that they are continue thinking about this topic on their campus, that will be great. Thank you everyone for joining this session. Just two reminders. Please do tweet today or post something on Facebook or Instagram, and use the hashtag NC Engage Campus. Again, hashtag NC Engage Campus. That is the official hashtag for the network. So please tweet, Facebook, or